I was 15 the first time hide and seek stopped being a game for me. A crisp October night when my parents left for an anniversary dinner, and I invited Chris and Maya over to the house we thought we owned after dark. The house smelled like the lemon cleaner my mom used, with the faint metallic edge of coin jars on the kitchen counter. And the basement light burned a steady yellow over the TV, like it had always been our makeshift fortress. We joked, set the rules, and pretended we were brave. At first, it was all the same childish bravado. Laughter that bounced off the wood paneling, the clack of a controller abandoned on the couch, the familiar footstep patterns that mark the edges of a house. We decided on hide and seek only inside, no attic, no roof, no leaving the yard, and we agreed that the seeker would count to 100 while the others hid. The first odd sound came like a low, slow creak from the second floor, a creak that did not match any floorboard pattern I knew. Chris said it was the house settling. Maya said maybe a raccoon. I said maybe we were making it up, the easy denial you use to keep your voice steady. But then the creak repeated at a measured pace, as if following a path, and the hair on my arms rose with a warmth I could not explain. In a few minutes, the night shifted, and one small rule had vanished without us noticing. What happened next is why I still listen for footsteps. My backstory is short but important. I grew up in a small street that edged a patch of woods. My father worked nights at the mill, and my mother taught part-time at the elementary school, so the house knew more solo hours than most. I learned to read by the porch light, I learned to be loud in the yard to keep boredom away, and I learned the sound of each hinge and each neighbor's car. My friends were Chris, who played drums, Maya, who drew maps in the margins of her notebooks, Luke, who lived 2 doors down and loved to make dares, and Sarah, who kept snacks in her locker at school like contraband. Those details matter because we were comfortable taking the house apart in childish games, and because I had a stubborn sense of ownership over what I considered safe. The past taught me to ignore certain noises, but it also taught me to notice patterns. I felt drawn to the basement because it was where my brother and I had built forts, where I hid bad report cards, and where the air always smelled faintly of old blankets and flour from the baking tins my mom kept there. It is that mix of safety and touch memory that makes the later sounds feel like betrayals. We started with the rules out loud, so everyone heard them and could use them as an anchor. I said, "You count, Chris will hide in the basement, Maya in the closet under the stairs, and no phones allowed." Chris grinned. "You are terrible at counting. I will cheat," and he laughed. Maya tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I will hide somewhere stupid so you find me fast," her voice small and confident. Luke and Sarah were waiting at the end of the street and texted for updates. Mr. Reed from across the lane had warned my mom once about leaving children unsupervised, and Mrs. Patel from 2 houses down kept an eye on our antics when she could see us from her kitchen window. We were a neighborhood that knew each other by name and dog. The first game went like any other: breathy whispers, playful rustles behind curtains, matches of silence to see who could hold out the longest. Then the count was over, and my footsteps as the seeker became attuned to a pattern that did not belong to any of us. When I called out, "Found you," you started with the usual responses: soft laughter, the scrape of a shoe, but Maya answered from a place she could not have been. Her voice came from upstairs when she was under the stairs. A whisper not mine, not Chris, mocking the rules we had set. I froze. Chris hissed, "Stop, that is not funny." A silence fell, thick like wet wool. I felt the cheap carpet under my bare toes, a chill that smelled faintly of rain and crushed grass, the taste of dust on my tongue like a coin. Chris moved to the closet, his hand on the knob, his breath loud in his ears. He asked, "Maya, are you there? Are you messing with us?" And the answer was a scraping sound from the hallway, slow and patient. We switched between denial and the urgent logic of youth that someone must be playing a trick. The sound came again, a footstep that paused outside the basement door, then two, each one lighter than the last, but precise, as if someone were testing our rhythm. I could smell old cardboard and soap and something behind them that belonged to a field, not our house. It took us seconds to decide to look, longer to realize we were not ready for what we would find. Dialogue stretched into something we could not retract, 8 exchanges of whispering that felt like bargaining. Chris said, "Do not open it." Maya whispered, "Why are we whispering? It is silly." I said, "We have to check. Someone is out there." Chris said, "No, call my dad. Call someone." His voice smaller. I answered, "We said no phones." Maya said, "Use the landline." She kept her hand on the closet knob and would not let go. I said, "Fine, but do not move." Chris moved anyway, and I hissed at him, "Stop." He laughed nervously. "This is stupid." "This is dumb." And the house answered with a slow groan that sounded like a door being opened somewhere 2 floors up. Maya made a small sound like a gasp and pressed her back against the closet door as if she could melt into it. The exchange ended with a sound from the hallway that matched the counting rhythm we had abandoned. We made a choice that felt like both courage and foolishness. We opened doors and corners and found only the trace of something that left no fingerprints, but left impressions in the air. The first time the tension rose enough that I understood we were no longer playing was when a thin rope of shadow moved along the second-floor railing. It was a moment of pure internal conflict, a coil of memory and instinct that I had to unwind quickly. I remember thinking of all the nights I had walked those stairs and how certain sounds belonged to familiar feet. Then I remembered a television show with a man outside a window in the dark and felt an irrational pull between that image and the knowledge of my own home. I decided to act. I called out to Luke by name because we needed another adult voice, even if it was lip service, and I took the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The memory of my father teaching me to check under beds came up like a reflex. I felt the latch under the porch light and tried to steady my hand. The decision to look out the window and see nothing was immediate and terrible. The window glass smelled of the night, cool and faintly green with lamplight, and when I pressed my face to the pane, I saw the street empty and the neighbor's cat staring back like an albumin photograph. For a second, I felt triumphant and ridiculous. Then a step behind me on the stairs was not mine. One of the moments of tension hit like an animal closing in. It began with my own breath quickening and moved into a memory of a childhood game where we hid under blankets to pretend the monsters could not find us. The air in that scene tasted like metal and old bread. My fingers brushed the warm plastic of the flashlight, and the hairs along my forearm tightened. I remember the sound, a single measured creak on the stair landing, then a pause, then another creak, as if someone were breathing with the house, matching our rhythm. My internal monologue told me to call my mother and make the safe world resurface. Another part of me told me to be brave and find the source. I felt the pressure between those impulses like a band tightening around my ribcage. I chose action. I told Chris to take the front door, and he replied with a whispered question under his breath, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yes," and we moved. But it did not feel righteous. It felt like a coin flipped in a dark room where who you hit did not matter. We moved through the house in a sequence of hushed commands that stretched into a dozen dialogue exchanges, each one a small negotiation of fear. I told Maya, "Stay put," and she replied, "I will not move." And then she asked, "Are you really going to check?" And I said yes, and held my breath. Chris said, "I am going with you." And I answered, "No, you stay with Maya." And he muttered, "Fine," but his feet were already at the stairs. I said, "Do you see anything?" And he whispered, "Not yet. Are you sure you saw it?" And I said, "I saw movement, a shadow, like a person." And he said, "Maybe it is a trick. Maybe it is a neighbor." And I said, "Whoever it is, they are inside the rhythm of the house, and that is wrong." He said, "Should we call 911?" And I said, "Not yet. We need something concrete." And he said, "You are insane." And I said, "Maybe I am, but I do not want whatever that was to have time to walk away." The conversation kept looping, each line a spark in a dry room. We reached the bottom of the stairs, and the basement door was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it. The air coming up was cooler, smelled of damp wood and a faint trace of something herbal and sweet that did not belong. At the central incident, someone was seen, or at least something answered like a person. The night sharpened into a series of sights and sounds that I will try to render accurately. First, there were footsteps above us, not the rhythm of our family, slower and with a deliberate placement. Then, a light you would not expect at that hour slipped across the hallway, a movement that took the shape of a person and vanished behind the bedroom door. Chris swore, "Did you see that?" And I said yes, and I felt my throat tighten. Maya started to cry softly and said, "It is gone, but I heard it." And Luke, who had arrived by bicycle because he'd heard our shouts at the porch, said, "We should go, now, now," and urged us toward the door. We argued, a tangled set of 8 to 10 exchanges where each person alternated between courage and the raw desire to run. The window latch rattled in the background, and the house made a small protesting creak as if to remind us it had always had a voice. Then something touched the outside of the basement window, 3 light taps that could have been a branch but felt like knuckles. The sound of the taps made my skin prickle and left behind a clean, confident silence that was worse than any noise. We fled then, not in a cinematic sweep, but in a messy, clumsy scramble. There were pulls on sleeves, whispers of "Go, go now," the scrape of sneakers on the porch, and a final look back I will never erase, where the basement window held a shadow like a person watching us, with a stillness that was not human. We banged on neighbors' doors. Mr. Reed opened his door and said, "What on earth is wrong with you children?" And we told him between heavy breaths that someone was in our house, that we had seen shadow, that the basement had been touched. He called the police. The sequence of the emergency response was procedural and measured. The operator asked for our address, asked if anyone was hurt, advised us to stay out on the porch and away from windows, and told us officers were en route. The response was crisp, the kind of voice that assumes control, and within minutes we heard sirens and lights cutting against the fogged edge of the street. The siren thumped distant, then closer, the smell of gasoline and rain folded into the air, and an officer named Hernandez asked us to repeat everything slowly. The official checklist was read out with clarity. They asked about forced entry, they asked us to show them where we had seen movement. They took notes and made polite requests. Their flashlights painted the house in white circles. They dusted door frames and checked window latches. They found no footprints outside, no sign of a forced door, and a single smear of something dark on the basement step that could not be identified at first glance. They collected a sample and promised to run it through local labs. The method felt exact and strangely comforting in its routine. The police procedural that followed was thorough and readable. Officers checked point of entry, canvassed the neighborhood, took statements from neighbors, logged our accounts in formal report format, and photographed the window latch, the smear on the step, and the imprints on the basement threshold. They left a card and told us to call if anything else happened. The report number was given, and we were advised that evidence would be processed within days. It felt like someone had translated our raw fear into paper and procedure. The officer who led the check was Officer Hernandez, who had a quiet voice and asked targeted questions. He suggested it might have been a prank or an animal. We left with a mix of relief and an ache that no report could fix. The next hours were a tangle of neighbors and phone calls. Sarah's older brother Mark arrived with a flashlight and stayed until my parents returned and filled in the scene. Mrs. Patel brought over tea and tried to make us eat. Mr. Reed said he had seen someone on his porch earlier, but could not be sure. Luke kept repeating "sorry" over and over like a rosary. We sat on borrowed lawn chairs under a streetlight and talked in small bursts. The conversation with the police left us with official words and no closure. There was a smear to test, a report number to remember, and a strange satisfaction that at least something official existed to hold the memory. Still, the absence of a clear intruder made the house feel like it had shrugged and gone on as if our fear were an inconvenience. One of the most developed moments of tension came later when I returned inside to check for items left behind. I stood at the top of the basement steps, holding a borrowed flashlight, and my internal voice argued against reason. I remembered the small childhood ritual of checking under the bed for monsters, the cheap trick of turning the light on and scaring away the imagined thing. The memory came with the texture of my pillow, the scent of detergent, and the soft sound of my mother humming. Then I noticed a rope on the lawn, a short length of cord half buried under leaves with one frayed end. The tactile detail of the rope between my fingers made my stomach drop. I felt the past 3 hours as a crowded room, my chest tight, my hands damp, the flashlight warm against my palm. My decision to toss the rope into the garbage can was practical and symbolic. I told the officer about it, and he bagged it as evidence. The small observation felt like a hinge that could open into something larger or close definitively. It stayed ambiguous. We had to make sense of everything afterward. There were follow-up calls from the station, the name of a detective, a polite man named Myers who took my statement again, and a neighborhood meeting where parents compared notes, and I felt our private fear become a public rumor. 3 other stories came onto the table that week that made me later title this collection as 3 Hide-and-Seek Horrors. Sarah told of a time she hid in the shed and heard whispering come from the tree line. Luke remembered a childhood dare where the group chased a shadow through the woods and watched a figure stand and disappear into the pines. Chris later revealed a night on his own porch when someone tapped the glass in time with his music. We built a list of names, of small coincidences. I kept thinking of the stranger we once met on the road, a man called Keith, who had invited us to play manhunt years before and then walked away into the dusk. These loose threads made the event feel less like a single aberration and more like an echo across different nights. About a month later, our neighborhood still talked. I slept with the light under the TV on for 3 nights running. Mark, who had stayed that night, brought over a second lock for our basement door. Officer Hernandez stopped by and asked how we were coping. My parents argued quietly about whether we should move. My teachers asked me if I felt safe, and I lied and said yes. The first month was a patchwork of small changes. I learned to recognize my heart's speed and to name the particular creak of the second floor in a way that allowed me to say it aloud without it swallowing me. The cord that had been bagged as evidence came back inconclusive, and Detective Myers recommended increased lighting and a neighborhood watch that Mr. Reed volunteered to lead. I kept seeing Luke in the grocery store, and he would look away quickly, embarrassed by his own role in the dares that had put us here. Maya returned to drawing maps, but her lines were tighter, thinner, as if she had learned to draw routes for an escape plan. My sleep was a map of short, sharp distances between wakefulness and dream. 3 months later, the tension had reshaped itself into a quieter strain. The smear sample was analyzed and returned with results that suggested organic material, but nothing to tie to a known person. Officer Hernandez called to say the case would stay open, but there were no leads. The neighborhood watch had a roster, and I found myself on the schedule, patrolling with a flashlight I barely knew how to hold. We did small things that felt like adult actions, like replacing the porch latch with a heavier bolt and installing motion lights near the basement window. Mrs. Patel set up a schedule to walk her dog past our house at certain hours, and Mr. Reed put a bench under his porch light so he could keep an eye on us. I tried to laugh with Chris again, but the laugh was hollow. School became an island. Teachers asked questions I skirted. The rhythm of our town absorbed the event and smoothed it into background noise. Yet at odd times I would pause and catalog the sounds of my own home as if decoding a language. When a truck passed the house on a wet night, I would tense and check the windows. The small habits changed everything. 6 months later, there was a kind of brittle normal. The official file remained open with a case number, Detective Myers making the occasional call to see if anything new had happened. He said sometimes these things reveal themselves with time. A neighbor remembers a license plate, a camera catches a silhouette, but so far there was nothing new. I had started driving late for shifts at the bakery, a small independence that felt like progress and like exile. Chris moved houses with his mom because of work, and we texted less. Maya applied to an art program out of town and called to say she wanted to see new horizons, that she could not stay where each window might contain memory. Luke moved into an apartment above his father's garage and insisted he was fine, while his hands still found small ways to fidget with door latches. The community had come together in a careful way. There was less talk about ghosts and more talk about vigilance. My mother began keeping the porch light on by habit, and my father began leaving a radio playing quietly through the night. My own sleep returned in pieces. Sometimes at 2 a.m., I would wake and find myself listening to the house as if it contained a foreign language, trying to decide if a creak was a word or a warning. The question that lingered like a shadow from those nights was simple and terrible. Did something cross from the backyard into our life? Or had the house always had the capacity to remind us it was older and stranger than we were ready to accept? If you have ever been in the middle of a laugh that turned into a silence so sudden you could hear your own blood, you will know the exact shape of that question. If this story moves you, tell me in the comments about the strangest sound you ever heard in your house, and start your comment with "My house." I read every comment and will bring a few up in next videos to compare what we heard and how we coped. I do not have neat answers. The police did what they could, neighbors did what they could, and we did what children do when the border between play and danger blurs. We learned to watch, to lock, to call, to rely on the small rituals that make a home feel like a machine we can maintain. The rope found in the yard remained an oddity, a question mark we could all point to. The smear was a small piece of material evidence that did not tell a story. The shadows kept their anonymity. What I can say with certainty is that the nights after that game were not the same as the nights before. I stopped hiding in closets for fun, and I never again volunteered to be the seeker in an empty house. The last image that stays with me is simple. It is the porch light cutting a pale circle into the damp grass, the silhouette of the house behind it, and the knowledge that a closed door can contain silence, and also the memory of a person who might have been there, for reasons we could not prove. If you stayed until the end, please subscribe and share a story in the comments. Maybe together we can learn the difference between the harmless noises of creaky wood and the signs that something else is moving in the dark.